go. All right, ladies and gentlemen, as you've heard, I live in South Africa, and thank you for the honor of presenting this paper here, Ashley and Helen. I really appreciate it. Colleagues, good day, or as we say in Afrikaans, goeiedag julle. Ek hoop het gaan goed. I must first, before I start my paper, I just quickly want to give you some context. Of course, within South Africa, we are 26 years past apartheid, and we still need to deal with a lot of that trauma and injustices. In my own context, I live within Bloemfontein. It's in the center of South Africa, and I work for the University of the Free State. And just at the beginning of the year again, we had major student protests where violence was exhibited. Students, over 50 students had to be arrested due to the violence. And this is basically a repeat of the 2016 Feast Must Fall. And this again due to the COVID pandemic, mostly because the government wasn't able to pay out student fees to help the students. You can see there how the students were sitting there protesting, and also there at the gates of our university. Then just about 2 weeks ago, within Bloemfontein, our own municipality is non-functioning, and again, the people of Bloemfontein protested violently due to the municipality's lack of service, and you can see there, and a young child was shot by a shop owner within the protest, and a lot of people again arrested. This is the violence that I only experienced within this year that was quite close to myself, and then of course dealing with the history of my own country. So this is problematic, and that led me to the questions of how do I deal with violence within a biblical context, and especially when we talk about violence from imprecations, from the Psalms of imprecations, and I was just not satisfied with the current answers provided within research, especially mostly reading the text from a Christian perspective, like Bonhoeffer and so on, indicating that a non-violent approach, leaving the violence in the hands of God, as the Psalms indicated. But that is not the context of the Psalms. What was the context of the Psalms, and what was the purpose of them? And that is what led me further, as I am in research of war in ancient Near Eastern studies. I research war. I started to focus on post-war rituals, and this is from that focus that I started to read the imprecatory Psalms and the paper that I present to you then today. So let's continue then with the paper. It's quite lengthy, so good luck to you also. Violence in the Psalms is undoubtedly not a strange occurrence. In the Psalms, violence is seen mainly in three contexts, where in many instances more than one category is present. The first of these is narrative context. In a narrative context, it's where the psalmist describes experiencing violence from others. In this regard, it can be experienced either by the individual or by the community as a whole. In most instances, the description of violence in a single psalm can move between the individual and the group, between the I and we. The first context can further be seen to operate on three levels, namely physical violence, or like in Psalm 74, violence on the structural level, when the basic structure of society itself is removed, for example, where the powerful attacks the poor, and physical violence through threatening behavior and words. From this first description, it is clear that violence in the Psalms already can be experienced in many ways, and that every aspect of life can be influenced by violence. Therefore, according to Firth, anything that by threat or excess force damage on individual or community's ability to live before God can be narrated within the Psalms as the experience of violence. The second context of violence in the Psalm is legitimated enforcement. This is an important category as it centers on Psalms that describes or anticipate violence as something necessary to restore order. In these Psalms, the focus typically falls on the king's actions as representative of God, or where it is expected from God to act directly and restore justice. In this context, it can be argued that the king as the representative of God has the specific function to perform justice in the community, and therefore violence is legitimated. The request to restore justice can also be directed directly to God. The third context is where the psalmist or the one praying the words prayed to God to pass some form of violence against an enemy of some sort. And these psalms are known as imprecations or psalms of cursing. Zenger sees the label psalm of cursing or imprecatory psalms as inappropriate, I myself as well, because these psalms do not curse, they present passionate lament, petition, and desires before God. It is on this point that reference to the shape of a lament is important to take note of again. Typical lament as an appeal or cry for help to God, a reference to some sort of past deliverance, not in every time. The lament proper with a three-way focus on God. This is also not always the focus, but these are the important elements. A confession of trust, a double petition for God's intervention, assurance of being heard, a vow to offer praise or enactment of praise in the petition. It is especially these last elements that play an important part in the ideology of Psalms, the confession of trust, a petition for intervention by Yahweh in being heard, and the vow of praise, as it will be indicated. The imprecatory Psalms is understood as a special form of petition and lament. There's not always a major element in all the Psalms. It can be embodied in a single line or a single verse in many of these psalms. This element of imprecation or passionate lament is in many instances ignored, or rather the focus in lament is rather on the elements of confession of trust. People try to ignore reading these psalms. The intervention on the praise of Yahweh, so that people mostly focus on the praise element and then leave the imprecations out. Those elements after the imprecations or the passionate lament. The scholar Falaniwe has already indicated in uncertainty of hearing and a study of change of mood, an important publication of how mood changes within the psalm, and this was taken further by the researcher Ian Kon Kim. He employed a traditional historical approach, asserting that the key to the question of what caused the shift of mood in the Lament Psalms can be found in the Holy War tradition of Israel. Kim cites Psalm 3 in particular as an example and points out that here we find war language in key places immediately before the occurrence of transition to confidence. He concludes that it is the faith rooted in holy war traditions that carries the psalms over to the obstacles that have been deployed against them. In 1999, Kim produced an article, Holy War Ideology, and the rapid shift of mood. In this article indicated three motivations for the rapid shift of mood in the Lament Psalms. Firstly, efficient use of military terminology, as often in the case in the Lament Psalms, where the extensive war imagery figures prominently as one of their figures. Secondly, the appropriate placement of the holy war ideologies. And thirdly, the enemies of the lamenter as are identified with Yahweh's enemies. Kim already indicated at the end of that publication the importance of a canonical understanding of the ideology of Yahweh as a warrior throughout the Old Testament and the Psalms. This theme echoes in the work of Bruggeman, where Yahweh is described in terms of a warrior, king, and a judge, and also in David Firth's understanding on the hermeneutics of the imprecatory Psalms, where Yahweh has to restore justice. Now, taking this into account, considering that the final shape of the Psalter took place in the Second Temple period after 515 BCE, after the Babylonian exile, the post-war reality of the Psalter should not be ignored. The outcome, consequences, and trauma of war was still a reality, and therefore the importance of the ideology promoted by the final redaction and shaping of the Psalter to become words of encouragement and hope to a community in turmoil, a community come to grips with a new life situation. So this is very important for our section. So I'm going to skip a section here and go to, now, if we say we're working with post-war language, we first need to understand war language. So war language can be understood as metaphors concerning warfare in many instances, but it plays an important function on the impact on the conceptualization of war in the ancient Near East context and Mediterranean context. Warfare language or military language metaphors is not a strange occurrence within the Old Testament. The imagery can communicate anything from attack, protection, imprisonment, to defeat, victory, or domination. Most of the imagery or the metaphors establish either honor or shame for God, a specific person, individual, or group. Honor is mostly portrayed within the military protection imagery. The king, with this imagery, typically represents the nation or the group. When one is studying Old Testament wisdom, poetry, and writings, Keller is one of the opinion that ancient warfare imagery consists both out of the practical and the ideological aspects of warfare. Within the practical level, the imagery is concerned with the implements of warfare, namely the weaponry and armory. Within the practical elements and the ideological aspects, one can identify three groups of warfare and symbols. This is the soldiers, divine imagery, the experiences of warfare, and again the weaponry, but this is now on a metaphorical level. So that is war language, just a basic introduction. Let us go then to the war language of a post-war context. This is after war. For many, the end of the battle is not the end of the hardship or the trauma. After a battle or war is finished, the victors have the opportunity to take what is now theirs, and those who are defeated experience defeat, domination, and humiliation at the hands of their oppressor and capturer. The outcome or results of a battle can, in the ancient Near East, understood as in terms of flight, plundering, humiliation, uberschreit, extermination of enemies, political and religious results of conquest, responses to defeat, and conflicted memories. Taking these outcomes of battle then into consideration, it's not strange that the dominant language of a post-war context is that of defeat and domination. Defeat and domination are conceptions with the ideological aspects of warfare, in where warfare to be defeated is to be shamed, and if one defeats another, the group or nation gains honor. Now, out of this, in that context of post-war context and the humiliation suffered within that context, certain rituals also start to develop to reintegrate people back into a community after war, or how to deal with the trauma in the ancient Near East, or to further shame them. In this regard, an important topic of the outcome of war is then these post-war rituals.
Lodewyk, you've become muted. I think it's my fault. Something jumped on my screen. Just unmute yourself and backtrack 30 seconds. Very sorry.
There we go. Can you hear me now? Great. Okay, I'm gonna start again with. So we talked about war language. We talked about post-war language, and now we talked about post-war rituals and the value of these rituals. And I was just a bit busy mentioning the typical post-war rituals that are used to integrate and help people after the war. Purification of warriors, appropriation of booty, construction of memorials and monuments, celebration and processions. Typically, we see those. And then an interesting one, laments. And we find these throughout the Old Testament. But an important element is laments. That the reach is typically made within when it comes to laments is that people identify and say when it comes to laments within the Psalms or in text, it says, no, we're just looking at certain sections of the laments and say, oh, these were probably also used as part of post-war rituals. There, I don't agree. I think in many cases, the laments themselves, part as within the final redaction of the Psalter, was used to help people to cope with the trauma, and especially the imprecatory psalms, as these psalms expressed passionate lament, voiced emotion, and extreme stress, and how to cope with and to deal with that. So it's from that perspective then that we go further. There's a section on honor and shame. That I can describe to describe the theory behind it. Just for interest sake, how much time do I have left? Because that will determine if I want to read this section as well. if I can just get an indication.
Yeah, you've got plenty of time, at least 15 minutes.
Okay, I think let's skip this so that we have more time on the psalm itself. So some of the rituals will become apparent within the description of honor when we read the text. I'm quickly going to read just the Psalm 58 then as well. This is a direct translation that I made for the music master on the theme or the song "Do Not Destroy" for David and Miktam for David and Miktam. Do you indeed speak righteous to your gods, or silence right? Do you do justice first restitute among the children of humanity? In your very hearts you are dishonest. Your hands deal out violence on the earth. The wicked are perverse from the womb. Those who speak lies go astray from their birth, from the womb onward. Your poison is like that of a serpent, like that of a deaf cobra adder that closes its ears, so that she may not hear the voice of the snake charmer, that of the clever chanter of incantations. O God, break their teeth in their mouth. You can hear now the imprecatory language. Crush the teeth of the young lions, Yahweh. Let them vanish like water that run off. When he shoots his arrows, let them sink down, or it can also be translated like grass that is trodden, let them wither. Like the snail that dissolves into slime, or a miscarriage, like the miscarriage of a woman that never sees the sun. Before they can put thorns like a briar, whether green or ablaze, may thee be swept away. The righteous will rejoice, for he sees vengeance, or retribution, when he bathes his feet in the blood of the wicked. And then the people will say, indeed, righteousness bears fruit. Surely there is a God who does justice on earth. I've put up this structure of the psalm, so you can follow it while I read. According to Maria in Psalm 58, the leaders are accused that they do not execute their duties in righteous and with fairness. They have abused the power they had due to the fact that they were in a position of leadership. It has not been used for the benefit of the nation, but for their own personal benefit. They ponder on all kinds of unrighteousness in their hearts, resulting in violence and injustice in the land. Thus, their outer corruption is the consequences of their inner corruption. This violence and injustice was the product of the hands of the leaders. They carried the responsibility for it themselves. The part of Psalm 58 describes an untenable situation in the land in which the righteous suffers due to the corruption, what was the order of the day among the wicked rulers. The rulers who are referred to in verses 2 to 3 belong to this class of people. Their wicked actions come with them from the womb. It is a lifestyle. They are wicked in totality of their existence, from the heart, in their thoughts, to their hands, in their deeds. They are liars, whose words are as fatal as the poison of a snake. Verses 2 to 3 specifically describe how the honor of the righteous is taken away by the unjust by keeping silent or not doing anything. In verse 3, there is a metaphor of totality where what the unjust are thinking in their hearts and what they do with their hands describe them as being dishonest and violent. Honor is being destroyed, is being destroyed in two ways, by injustice and by violence. The nature of the violence of those who are wicked is further described in the imagery of verses 4 to 6. They have always been this way. From their birth and thereafter, it confirms that they have always been like this. They therefore never represented justice. The lies again confirm the absence of justice, where in verse 5 uses the imagery of the serpent and the ears that do not listen, showing that they ignore their responsibility to justice. In verse 6, the image of them refusing to hear, these serpents, is further intensified by the mention of the mantic person, of the snake charmer, who plays his craft in vain. In taking up the topic of Psalm 58:6, it is interested not in evaluating the mantic practices, but in giving a metaphorical representation of the hopelessness of charming the wicked, and so turning back their poisonous threats. The hyperbolic language of the poet emphasizes the absolute corruption of the wicked. They are beyond redemption. That being said, the wicked are in the position of power. This position of honor, due to rank, needs to be challenged. And the righteous, or the one praying the psalm, they can't do the challenging. Either the challenge must be acknowledged by the public and must be challenged by someone in the same or higher rank according to the rules of honor and shame. Then the imprecation in verse 7. In verse 7, the poet describes the wicked as lions. Elsewhere in the book of Psalms, lions are also used as a figure to describe the enemies. Breaking the teeth of the lions will result in their not being able to hunt down their prey anymore. Thus, the poet prays that the effectiveness of the wicked to bring about their evil purposes must be neutralized by Yahweh. The petition to God to challenge them is now a challenge for honor and shame, to destroy their power, their dominance, and restore honors to those that it has been taken from. It is here where the research of Firth is interesting when it comes to the Psalms of imprecation. He indicated that these Psalms indicate a motive of violence showed evidence of consistent patterns. The presence of such a pattern is further suggestive of a policy with the final redactors of the Psalter work demonstrating a specific view on violence. This pattern in the Psalms of false accusation, prayers for protection, and Psalms of sickness has indicated the response to violence that was appropriate to the nature of the violence that was experienced within the type of the setting. In other words, an eye for an eye type of setting. This pattern reveals itself in four main areas: the consistent imminence of physical violence, the predominance of psychological violence, the rejection of the right of human retribution, and the limitation on the violence that could be sought from God. In verse 7, a petition is made to God to break the teeth of the lions of the wicked in their wicked in their mouths. They did not speak justice in verses 2 to 3. Now their mouths are broken. They are removed from doing or saying anything further. They are shamed by the action, and how should this then be understood? Well, within the ideological aspects of violence, those aspects they explain the conceptions of warriors and enemies, victory and defeat. In this regard, not only are the conceptions of enemies important, but also that of Yahweh. As the God of Israel, who is conceptualized as a warrior and an enemy, this conception of a divine warrior has been scrutinized by many scholars. Within the ideological aspect, the relation between politics and religion should also be noted. Yahweh acts as a patron God to Israel, and Israel is seen as a client that is protected and in a relationship with God. In this ideological understanding of violence, this relationship may also be understood in terms of the group, Israel, that shifts from the religious partner to that of citizenry, a political aspect, where disobedience by the group towards Yahweh becomes treason against the king or the representative of Yahweh. In Psalm 58, it is those who represent Yahweh that is performing the treasoning, the godly or men of justice, of injustice. In a post-exilic context, it is the oppressors that are the rulers. As the patron God of Israel, the belief is that Yahweh should help Israel in all the stages of battle, internal and external. And the primary bond of the patron-client relationship is that of loyalty that is understood in terms of honor. This honor was seen as a mutual affair and was achieved not by one party only, but by both as they represented each other. The purpose of the relationship was to keep divine order in the cosmos and known world. The relationship was thus threatened by disorder, chaos, enemies, in Psalm 58, the wicked or unjust. By attacking or challenging the honor, therefore acquired honor, of the people, either the individual or Israel, it is expected from Yahweh to act. At this point in the battle, Yahweh is in battle with Israel and not with the other nations or their gods that he is using to fight against Israel. Yahweh's honor has already been challenged and shaped by the acts of Israel and therefore using the other nations to defeat Israel, the exile, and strengthening and emphasizing the shame Israel has brought over Israel through their acts of disobedience before the exile. Now, to further expand this point, one needs to understand the significance of victory and defeat in the warfare imagery. The victory and defeat in the context of violence must be understood in relation to honor and shame again. To be the victor is to enhance the victorious king and nation's honor, acquired honor, while to be defeated is to be shamed. The victor also enhances the honor of the deity of the victorious nation, and shame is brought over the deity of the defeated nation. Defeat can be experienced on an individual level in war by a soldier or a citizen as part of the army, nation, or group, or on social communal level. As ideological aspects of warfare, victory and defeat that are evaluated in terms of honor and shame, and who has won the challenge of honor, provide a rhetorical function in the text to indicate where power and domination truly rest. The purpose of domination is to have power and therefore realize when the other person or group is subjected to one's control, so that the victor has power over their very existence as well as their possessions. The victor in battle would want to ensure and enforce the knowledge to all honor, power, and domination resides with him, and therefore he uses the time after the outcome of the battle to make sure that all honor and status of the defeated is destroyed. These challenges to acquire honor were accomplished mainly through the certain post-war rituals that we've already mentioned. These injustices against the people of God can firstly be understood on a social communal level before the exile, and secondly, due to the post-exilic context, due to the battle and now the post-war rituals that are further performed. The lament, and in the case of Psalm 58, the passionate lament or imprecatory lament, is the result of the shaming injustice, where the people express their pain, hardship, and shaming by those who are now supposed to be performing justice, either their own leadership or under the foreign leadership. In Psalm 58, verses 8 to 10, then, the imagery continues where the wicked is now shamed, honor taken away. Instead of the righteous, things that indicate power for the wicked is now used to shame them. Water is often used in the Psalms as a symbol of the problems and trouble that threaten to overwhelm the righteous. And here in Psalm 58, the image of water is literally turned on its head. Instead of being a symbol of the threat of the enemies against the righteous, the poet uses it here as a symbol of the fate that will befall the enemies. They will despair like water when poured out on the ground. The image of the water flowing away makes two statements. Firstly, it indicates the existence of the wicked flowing away. Secondly, the water bringing into memory the chaotic waters that symbolize the wicked's threatening power now flowing away, taken away from them. The image of disempowerment continues when the weapons arrows that represent slyness and unpredictability that is having no more effect. The image of the snail that melts away only here in the Bible is Pax legomena. However, the image is particularly descriptive, and it can seem that it was thought from the trail of the slime that was left behind that the snail gradually dissolves, and finally there's nothing left but an empty shell. The wish of the poet that the wicked should totally perish. The image of a stillborn child who does not see the sun also occurs in Job and Ecclesiastes. However, the psalm uses it as in a very unique way, in that he prays it for the wicked of his enemy. The revenge that the poet desires for his enemy is particularly strong here when one thinks of the trauma that accompanies the miscarriage. The Ridderbos quite fittingly calls it beeld van het mees troostlose lot. There's no sorry, now the English word left me there, but yeah, so there's no comfort. There's no comfort in the image. The image of the weeds are eradicated also speaks of the absolute malcontent which the poet imprecates his image before God. Weeds are never welcome and they always are eradicated. That's the other image that comes here. The large image that the poet uses here is that of a storm wind that sweeps away everything in its path. In Psalm 148, again, the stormy wind is portrayed as the instrument in God's hand and that exalts his will. In Job, we find the same imagery. This image emphasizes the poet's thoughts for vengeance on his enemy, desires for total destruction of the wicked. It is important to take note, of course, that the fact that the poet addresses his desire for vengeance to God. Thereby, he acknowledges the fact that vengeance belongs to God alone. He does not take revenge himself, but he prays that God will avenge him. Honor must be restored to Yahweh, the patron. Verses 11 to 12 are the declaration or announcement of victory and proverbial statements. The declaration has two elements again, as in the beginning, justice and violence. In verse 2, the righteous shall suffer due to the unrighteousness of the wicked. They are treated unfairly, especially when it comes to justice. They suffer due to the corruption of the wicked that abuse their power and do not use it for the benefit of all. In verses 11 to 12, the situation is turned around. Here, the righteous does not suffer anymore. They rejoice. The joy is the result of the retribution against the wicked. The righteous for sure rejoices in God's administration of justice, but the manner in which he experiences it here is indeed in the destruction of the enemies in which he rejoices. Honor is being restored to the righteous. In the one hand, justice is restored, in the other, honor. The imagery of the righteous bathing their feet in the blood of the enemies can now be seen as an image of victory and domination, a battle that is won. Now the victor is for the other side, therefore a post-war battle image of the victor shaming the defeated is seen. The image relates to other imagery where the feet is used to trample on the defeated. Although it's righteous that are joyful and their honor is restored, it's also the honor of God that is again restored of the original battle and shaming by God by his own nation. And where now it's restored again, where verse 12 exclaims this: the image of the fruit of the right indicates that the righteous will again experience justice with the fall of the wicked. And in the second part of the verse, the conflict in verse 2 is resolved, as it indicates that justice must be with Yahweh. In the same process, honor is restored to Yahweh as the patron of Israel and his people. Just in concluding, I'm going to make just a few remarks to the placement of 58 in the Psalms. Is there still time to do that? Okay. So we are reading now the psalm within its final shaping, within the final redaction, taking account that the original meaning probably had anything indicated something in the context of David, within the Davidic grouping that it falls within book 2 of the Psalter, where it probably indicated a misjustice that didn't serve within the kingdom. But then we need to read it within the larger context of book 2 as well, and then within the Psalter. So in an overview of the Psalter, the story of the Psalter, we can say that it begins in book 1 with the story of the reign of King David. That's Psalms 1 to 42. Solomon's reign is recounted in book 2, 42 to 72. And book 3 tells the story of the divided kingdoms and their eventual destruction by the Assyrians and the Babylonians. Our psalm within book 2 then, building up to the mishaps of the kingdom and administration of the monarchy. Book 4 relates to the struggles of the exiles in Babylon to find identity and meaning in the world of changed circumstances. And then book 5 from Psalm 106 celebrates the return to Jerusalem and the establishment of a new Israel with God as the sovereign God. So within book 4, God is again enthroned as the true God of Israel after the monarchy failed. And this is established. And book 2, Psalm 58, falls in the upbuild to this for book 4 as well. So having set out its formal introduction within Psalm 53 in that collection of Davidic Psalms, 7 different enemies of David in successive Psalms is seen from Psalm 54 to Psalm 60. Each of these 7 Psalms concludes with a note of confident triumph, typical of the end of a lament. The pattern that emerges in the Psalter is a placement of Davidic Psalms appropriate for the time of the national exile and restoration to a specific purpose of the editor. Psalm 58, within the smaller collections of Psalm 57 to 59, all with the heading "Do Not Destroy," indicate that failure or end of the king and judges or representative gods who were supposed to ensure justice and effective rule. So the monarchy failed. The text asks for how is justice and honor going to be restored originally. Bring back the original king, bring back God. Therefore, the enthronement Psalms within book 4. But we're also now in a post-exilic context where restoration needs to be taken into context. So these Psalms are also part of the restoration process. And in this case, we have read it as part of a post-war ritual that helps to give voice to the trauma that was experienced within the exile. So therefore, we can say Psalm 55 asks firstly that those whose honor has been lost due to the injustice of those who were supposed to perform it must be restored, and the honor of those who suffered be restored. Secondly, that justice be placed in the hands of God again after the failure of the kingdom and the king after the Babylonian exile rulership. And justice must be placed again in the hands of Yahweh. We see this in the enthronement of Yahweh in book 4. And thirdly, in the book of Psalms, Psalm 58 contribute to the restoration language of the will restore honor and bring justice to Israel after a time of war. I have then another 10 pages to continue, basically to continue to explain within trauma theory how this psalm relates in helping people to voice their trauma and to express and using this type of language as part of a ritual to give voice, to restore, and to cope again with further life experiences. But I think let's stop there. I think this is at the end where I need to come with the imprecatory language to understand it within the context of the Psalter as part of restorative language, not only as imprecations, people cursing other people and then saying, oh, from out the New Testament, we can say this is not a constructive language, but rather saying within a post-war context, this language is very much needed to help people that experience violence, to give voice to violence, to help them with their trauma, and to come to a road of recovery. Thank you.
Let's thank Lodewyk for this wonderful paper.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, once again, please. Oh, good. We do have questions starting to roll in. Yeah, keep them coming. Yeah, I'll start with a question here that's very similar to the one I was thinking of. Kristen says, thank you very much for this paper. I'm wondering if you've thought at all about how issues of honor and shame are at play with violence and the ongoing attempts to deal with trauma in your country's own context.
Yeah. I'm still unmuted. Yeah. Yeah, I think this is precisely the reason where I started to do research within war language, is to give voice to that experiences. I think it is a question in reality where we need to deal with parties involved within the context within South Africa, within different races, and how each of these races experience the trauma within apartheid, and how now again on different levels again there is new oppression, because we are still dealing with honor and shame issues where people in apartheid was truly shamed and marginalized and violent. Well, you all know the history of the violence that took place as well. But now we are also in a situation where not much has happened in the context of restoration. The question, the outcome of the honor and shame challenges is to, within a post-war context, is to bring restoration. Now, the context still, and that's where you saw the imagery at the beginning of the slide, is that we are dealing with the rich getting still richer. And I don't want to connect the rich with a specific group or race or a government party or anything in that context, because the problem is the marginalized, the poor, that is the largest section of South Africa, is still experiencing the same context as what they experienced about 20, 30 years back. Maybe not in a violent way, but now it is on a new, different, not on a physical violent way necessarily, but we are talking about experiencing psychological violence and further breakdown of their mental capability and understanding of their context. And I think this is where we are now struggling with this. So it's we need to deal with honor that was taken away 30 years ago, restoring that honor, But now we've got new issues where honor is also on a psychological level, where we thought that the people were supposed to, the judges, those who are supposed to bring justice, is not supporting justice. And this is a new trauma again. So we are dealing now with two major traumas, and you can see the result of it within the pictures that I showed at the beginning. Students protesting because it was promised that they will have education. Now they don't get free education. There's no support for them. Municipalities that are failing because there's no money. Money that is used is going to corruption, and people are literally dying of water. We sit with days without water, we sit days without electricity, and that is even within established neighborhoods. So we can't just say, oh no, it's just certain people that's being affected by this. It is everybody that's being affected by this. Sorry, that's a long answer.
But it's very helpful to understanding the importance of this psalm, and it makes me wonder if perhaps it's yet another good example of why ignoring imprecatory psalms in the lectionary has been unwise, unhelpful.
Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question. Asked.
Sorry, I can't hear you. Ashley, you are muted.
In ritual purity, and used mostly with water, it seems. So what might that mean for this psalm?
Sorry, I missed the largest section of the question. I only heard the last sentence.
Oh, I'm so sorry. The word for washing seems to be used most often in hospitality contexts or in ritual purity. What does that mean for the psalm?
Yeah, I think an important thing that we need to take into account within the final redactions of the Psalter is that there's a very strong wisdom element and then also a cultic element that is present within the Psalms. So there will always, with water imagery, this will be related. I think although in this context, the metaphor is quite clear, if I understand the question correctly, but the metaphor here deals with waters that is also associated with the chaotic waters, and therefore it's a violent imagery that can be seen. And of course the verbs there to sweep away, the flowing away, while within rituals, bathing rituals, I don't associate those verbs with the water. I hope that is what the question was related to. Yeah. So it's part of the destruction of the enemies in this case, and not as much as within piety language, within cultic context.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Mm.
I think that's all the questions we have time for at the moment. Although I think at the very end we're going to have a few minutes to sort of open up the table to any questions. But perhaps we'll take a 5-minute break at this point to go refill our drinks in this early morning or afternoon or evening, as the case may be. And we'll come back at 20 to the hour, whatever that hour is for you. So we'll come back in a few minutes.